They say old age is a time for reflection, a season when life slows just enough for a man to sit back and take stock of everything he has done. Every choice, every regret, every fleeting joy that once seemed endless. I never thought I'd reach this stage of life feeling so empty. The death of my only son, David, left me with a silence I had never known before. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with the simple absence of his voice or the stillness of a house that no longer echoed with his visits. No, this silence was deeper, heavier. It sat inside my chest, pressing against my ribs, suffocating me in ways grief alone never could. It was the silence of knowing that my lifeline, my one reason to keep going, was gone. David had been more than just my son. He had been my strength when my own body began to fail me. He had been my provider when the consequences of my reckless youth caught up to me in ways I could no longer outrun. When my hands trembled too much to inject my own insulin, David was there, steady and patient. When the medical bills from cancer treatment started stacking higher than I could manage, he covered them without hesitation. He never asked for anything in return, never made me feel like a burden. He just took care of me, because that was the kind of man he was. The kind of man I had always hoped to be. And now, he was gone. I suppose I have no one to blame but myself for the way life turned out. My younger years had been wild, reckless, even. I had chased pleasures without thinking about consequences, had lived fast and carelessly, convinced that time was on my side. I squandered money on things that never truly mattered, ignored the warnings my body gave me, and made choices that would carve irreversible damage into my future. I had been foolish. I had been selfish. And now, I was paying the price. But amidst all that chaos, one good thing had come into my life, Julia. Ah, my beautiful Julia. Even after 48 years of marriage, I still called her beautiful, because she was. Time had taken its toll on both of us, had carved lines into our faces and stolen the vibrancy of youth from our bodies. But she still had that same spark in her eyes, that same laughter that had once made life feel less painful, less heavy. She had been my anchor, my companion through every storm, the one person I believed would stand by me until the very end. Or so I thought, because grief, as it turns out, was not the worst thing a man could endure. No, betrayal was. Grief has a way of blinding a man, of dulling his senses just enough to make him miss the things that should have been obvious. I thought my pain had reached its peak the day I buried my son, but I was wrong. The worst was still to come. David's death had been so sudden, too sudden. One day, he was standing strong, full of life, filling our home with his steady presence, and then, in what felt like the blink of an eye, he was gone. The doctors called it an aggressive infection, something that spread through his body faster than they could control. But it didn't make sense to me. How could a young, strong man, my son, my protector, my last remaining hope, be laughing with me one evening and lifeless the next? I tried to reason with myself, tried to accept that death was unpredictable, that sickness did not always come with warnings. But something inside me resisted that explanation. It wasn't just grief making me restless. It was something deeper, something clawing at my gut, refusing to let me find peace. I had convinced myself that we were all grieving together, that the house was weighed down by sorrow and nothing else. Family had gathered, traveling from different states, filling the house with murmured condolences and heavy sighs. Julia had barely left the living room, sitting in silence, her hands folded in her lap, staring off into the distance like she had lost all words. My younger brother, Daniel, had arrived that morning, pulling me into a tight hug the moment he stepped through the door. His voice had been thick with emotion when he whispered, "I'm so sorry, brother. I wish I could take your pain away." I believed him. But pain, the kind that cuts deeper than death, was yet to come. The autopsy report arrived the day after we laid David to rest. I had been sitting alone in the living room when the envelope was handed to me. My fingers, weak with age and exhaustion, trembled as I tore it open, unfolding the crisp white papers that held the answers I wasn't sure I was ready for. My eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but I forced myself to focus, to read every word carefully. And then, my breath caught. David hadn't just died from an infection. There was something else. I read the words again, slower this time, as if my mind needed confirmation of what my eyes had just absorbed. I gripped the paper tighter, my nails digging into the edges as an icy wave of disbelief washed over me. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat heavier than the last. The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. The air grew thick, pressing down on my lungs, making it harder to breathe. I forced myself to look up, my gaze scanning the faces around me, searching for something, an explanation, a hint of shared confusion. Julia sat across from me, her posture stiff, her hands tightly clasped together in her lap, her fingers twisted against each other, ringing with an anxiousness that sent a chill down my spine. She wasn't looking at me. In fact, she wasn't looking at anyone. And then I saw it. The way her eyes flickered toward Daniel. Just for a second. A brief glance. A quiet, almost imperceptible connection. And then, just as quickly, she looked away. That was the moment I knew. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. I told myself I was imagining things. How could I not? The very idea that my own wife, my Julia, could be looking at my younger brother in that way was unthinkable. We had been married for 48 years. Nearly half a century of shared memories, laughter, pain, and endurance. If there was one thing I had been sure of in this life, it was Julia's love. We had built a life together, stood by each other when the world turned against us, and now, after everything, I was supposed to believe she had eyes for Daniel? The thought alone felt like an insult to the foundation of our marriage. No, I was being foolish. Grief does strange things to a man. It whispers in his ears, makes him see ghosts in the shadows, hear things that aren't there. That had to be it. My mind was unraveling under the weight of David's death, twisting reality into something sinister. I was searching for answers in places they didn't belong, seeing betrayal in nothing more than shared sorrow. And yet, the feeling wouldn't go away. It clung to my chest like a stone, pressing down, making every breath feel heavier than the last. It was there when I woke up in the morning, in the way Julia moved around the house with a restlessness that didn't seem to come from grief alone. It was there in the way she avoided my gaze, in the moments when her silence stretched too long, in the way her fingers would twitch like she was holding back words she dared not speak. But I ignored it. I had to, until I couldn't anymore. It happened so quickly, so effortlessly, that if I hadn't been watching, I would have missed it. A glance, a single, fleeting moment across the room. Julia's eyes met Daniel's, and something passed between them. Something unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't the look of a grieving widow leaning on family for support. It wasn't sadness or shared pain. No, it was something else entirely. A quiet understanding. A familiarity that sent a cold shiver crawling down my spine. My fingers curled into the armrest of my chair. My heart clenched, a slow, painful squeeze that left me breathless. I wanted to be wrong. God, I needed to be wrong. Was I imagining it? Was my mind truly playing games with me? I forced myself to look away, to shake the thought from my head, but the damage had already been done. Once a man notices something, he cannot unsee it. Once suspicion takes root, it grows, spreading its poison through every thought, every moment, every interaction. And deep down, where logic had no power and truth lay bare, I knew. A man always knows when something is wrong. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, Julia turned to me with a soft smile. "Do you mind if I stay back for a little while?" she asked, her voice light, almost casual. "I just want to watch my favorite show." Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. I had been married to this woman for nearly 5 decades, and in all that time, I could barely recall the last time she had ever stayed up late just to watch television. Julia had always been one for routine. An early dinner, a warm bath, and then straight to bed. Even before David passed, She had never been the type to keep the television on into the late hours of the night. But tonight, she wanted to stay up. I didn't question her. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want her to see what was brewing in my mind. Of course, I said, forcing a smile that felt unnatural on my face. I'll be in bed if you need me. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket over me, but sleep never came. My mind wouldn't rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that glance she had shared with Daniel earlier, the silent exchange that had rattled something deep within me. I tried to push it away, to remind myself that I was just grieving, that grief warps reality and makes men see demons where none exist. But the more I told myself I was imagining things, the more I felt the walls closing in on me. Minutes passed, then an hour, and another. The house had gone still, the kind of silence that should have been comforting. But it wasn't. Underneath our bedroom door, the faint glow of the television flickered in erratic patterns, shifting shadows across the wooden floor. Something didn't feel right. I turned onto my side, staring at the door, willing myself to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. But it was useless. My gut screamed at me, "Get up. Go see." My joints ached as I swung my legs over the bed, my body heavy with age and the weight of uncertainty. I moved slowly, careful not to make a sound. As I stepped into the hallway, the faint hum of the television filled my ears, a soft, rhythmic noise against the stillness of the night. I should have heard dialogue, laughter, something, but instead, all I heard were muffled sounds. Not from the TV, from something else. I inched forward, my breath caught in my throat, my heartbeat a slow, painful thud against my ribs. My eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but I could still make out the shifting light from the living room ahead, casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. And then, as I turned the corner, I saw it. Julia wasn't watching the show. She was acting it out, with Daniel. My blood turned to ice. There, in my own home, just a day after we buried our son, the woman I had loved for nearly half a century was wrapped in the arms of my own blood. For a moment, my body betrayed me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as though my mind refused to process what my eyes were showing me. I had been worried that grief was playing tricks on me, twisting my thoughts into something dark and irrational. But this was real. A quiet, strangled sound left my throat before I could stop it. Julia's head snapped up, and in that moment, as her eyes met mine, the truth, the undeniable, gut-wrenching truth, shattered the fragile world I had been desperately clinging to. This was no accident, no misunderstanding. This had been happening long before tonight, and I had been a fool not to see it sooner. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but there they were, Julia and Daniel, tangled together, lost in each other, oblivious to the world around them. To me, their clothes were scattered across the floor, discarded like the remnants of my trust. That very floor, where I had watched David take his first steps, where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings, the home I had built with my wife, the life we had woven together over decades. It had now become the setting for my greatest humiliation, but I refused to look away. This wasn't grief playing tricks on me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. I needed proof. My fingers felt like ice as I unlocked my phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. I opened the camera, the screen illuminating my face in the dim light of the room. With a steady hand, steadier than I thought possible, I pressed record. The screen captured everything. The way Julia's head rested against Daniel's shoulder, the way his hand traced the curve of her back, the way they whispered, their voices low, intimate. They weren't just in each other's arms. They were comfortable there, familiar. This wasn't new. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with rage and something else, something far worse. Grief. Not for my son this time, but for the life I had convinced myself was real, for the love I had believed in. How long had this been happening? Had it started after David died? Or had it been going on for years? Right under my nose, hidden beneath every stolen glance, Every meaningless excuse? Had she laid beside me at night, knowing she belonged to someone else? My jaw tightened. I had spent my life as a man of reason, a man who looked for logic in the face of emotion. But this? There was no reasoning with this. This wasn't just betrayal. This was cruelty. A marriage that had lasted nearly 5 decades, shattered in a single night. A brother I had protected and cared for, revealed as a snake in my own home. I tightened my grip on the phone. My breathing was shallow, controlled, but inside, something was breaking. Something dark. I didn't know what I was going to do. Not yet. But I wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. That night, she never came to bed. I lay there in the darkness, my body still, my mind racing. I had spent nearly 5 decades beside Julia, yet at that moment, she felt like a stranger. A woman I didn't know. A woman who had quietly abandoned our life, our history, for him. The hours crawled by. The house settled into silence. But inside me, there was a storm raging. A storm I couldn't quiet. I wanted to move, to confront her, to demand an answer. But I knew there was nothing she could say that would make it right. By the time the first light of morning crept through the curtains, I forced myself to rise. My body felt heavier than usual, as though the weight of betrayal had sunk into my very bones. My legs ached as I stepped out of bed, but I needed to see her. I needed to see if she would acknowledge any of it. When I entered the living room, I felt like I had stepped into a different world. Everything was neat. Too neat. The couch cushions were perfectly arranged, the throw blanket folded with precision. The coffee table, where her dress had been carelessly discarded the night before, was spotless. The air smelled faintly of morning coffee. The betrayal washed away as if it had never existed. I swallowed hard, my eyes scanning the space. The quietness was unnatural, suffocating. And then I saw her. Julia stood in the kitchen, humming softly as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Her movements were easy, graceful, too composed for a woman who had spent the night wrapped in another man's arms. She turned when she heard my footsteps, her expression warm, almost affectionate. "Good morning," she said, her voice light, unbothered. As if we were just another ordinary couple, waking up to another ordinary day. I stared at her, waiting for something, anything, a flicker of guilt, a shadow of hesitation, a falter in her voice. But there was nothing, not a trace of shame, not a hint of regret. The woman who had stood beside me for 48 years, who had shared my bed, who had buried our son just days ago, looked at me with the ease of someone who had done nothing wrong. And that was when I knew. She wasn't going to confess. She wasn't going to apologize. She was going to pretend that last night never existed. And maybe she thought I would too. I met her gaze and forced a smile. "Good morning," I replied, my voice steady. If she wanted to pretend, then so would I. But unlike her, I wasn't pretending out of denial. I was planning. Julia moved around the kitchen as if nothing had changed, humming a tune I used to love. She poured herself coffee, the scent of it filling the air, acting like the devoted wife she had long ceased to be. Every detail of her movements was controlled, deliberate. She had already convinced herself that last night never happened. But I wasn't so easily fooled. "I'll be in my study," I said, my tone casual. She barely looked up, only nodding as she stirred her coffee. I turned away and made my way down the hall, my steps slow but purposeful. The moment I shut the door behind me, I let out a long breath. The rage I had been holding back simmered just beneath my skin, but I wouldn't let it consume me. Not yet. Instead, I picked up my phone and dialed. "I need the divorce papers ready as soon as possible," I said, skipping pleasantries. "Everything, our assets, the house, the bank accounts. I want this done quietly, but quickly." There was a brief silence before my lawyer spoke. "Understood. I'll have the documents drafted by the end of the day," he replied. He didn't ask why. He didn't have to. He had been my friend for years, long enough to know when I was done with something, or someone. Step 1. In motion. But I wasn't done. I picked up my phone again. this time calling an old contact at the police department. My younger brother, Daniel, had always walked a fine line between risk and ruin. He flirted with danger, made money in ways I never cared to know, but I had known. I had heard the whispers, the rumors about money laundering, shady business dealings, quiet transactions that could put him behind bars for a long time. I had ignored them before. After all, he was my brother, but not anymore. "Detective," I said, my voice calm, controlled. "I have some information about a financial crime you might be interested in." I gave them Daniel's name. I told them where to look. And then, I sat back in my chair and waited. Julia and Daniel thought they had one, that they had humiliated me, that I would crumble. They had no idea what was coming. They thought I was weak, an old man, broken by grief, blind to their betrayal. But they had no idea I was way ahead of them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my study as I sat in my chair, listening to my lawyer's voice on the phone. "The papers are ready," he said. "Everything is set on your terms. Just say the word." I exhaled slowly, letting the moment sink in. "Good. Bring them to my house at 7. I hung up and immediately dialed the next number. The call was picked up on the second ring. "You were right," my contact at the police department said, his tone sharp with urgency. "We found more than enough on Daniel. If we move forward, he's looking at 40 years minimum." 40 years. Daniel, my own brother, had thrown away his freedom the same way he had thrown away my trust. "Do it," I said. Everything was set in motion. Now, all I had to do was wait. At precisely 6:30 p.m., Julia, Daniel, and I sat in the living room, wrapped in a suffocating silence that neither of them seemed to notice. The television hummed in the background, playing the evening news, its dull voices blending into the sound of Julia stirring her tea. She looked completely at ease, as if she wasn't sipping tea in the same house where she had committed the ultimate betrayal. Daniel, meanwhile, lounged back on the couch, legs crossed, arms draped lazily over the cushions. He was too relaxed, too comfortable. He thought he had one. I had spent decades providing for these people, building a home, a life, and they had turned it into a playground for their deceit. But they had no idea that tonight, everything would change. I leaned back in my chair, letting my gaze settle on them both before clearing my throat. "I downloaded a movie on my phone earlier today," I said casually, reaching into my pocket. "I think you two might find it interesting." Julia glanced up, offering a soft smile. "Oh, what's it about?" Daniel smirked, stretching his arms behind his head. "Hope it's not one of those boring old war films." I chuckled. "Oh, it's got plenty of action." And then I pressed play. The screen flickered to life. The video played in high definition. Their laughter faded instantly, because there they were, tangled together in the very room we were sitting in now. Their voices, their whispers, the soft rustle of sheets. It all filled the air like a haunting melody. Every detail, every stolen touch, every betrayal, captured in sickening clarity. Julia's fingers slipped from her teacup, sending porcelain shattering against the floor. Daniel, once so cocky, so sure of himself, turned ghostly pale. Neither of them could look away. Neither of them could speak. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together, my voice eerily calm. "Enjoying the show?" Julia turned to me, her lips parting as if to say something, but no words came. Daniel's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. Good. I wanted them to feel this. I wanted them to drown in the same humiliation they had so carelessly thrown at me. And then, the doorbell rang. Right on time. Julia flinched at the sound. Daniel's eyes darted toward the front door, his body going rigid. I rose from my seat, slow and deliberate, relishing the way they both stiffened as I moved. Without a word, I strode to the door and pulled it open. My lawyer stepped inside first, carrying a leather briefcase. His expression was unreadable, professional. Then, behind him, 2 uniformed police officers followed. Julia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel shot to his feet. What the hell is this? I turned back to them, my face blank, my voice controlled. Julia, I said, my tone almost gentle. Our marriage is over. You can sign the papers now, or we can drag this out in court. Either way, you're leaving this house tonight. Her eyes darted to the documents my lawyer placed on the table. Her fingers trembled. You can't be serious, she whispered. Oh, I'm very serious. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. You think you can just— Daniel, I interrupted, my tone sharp. He shut up immediately. I would worry less about Julia and more about yourself. I nodded toward the officers. They're here for you. One of the cops stepped forward. Daniel Carter, you are under arrest for multiple counts of financial fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The color drained from his face. What? Turn around, the officer instructed. Julia let out a strangled gasp as Daniel tried to step back, but the officers were faster. Within seconds, his hands were wrenched behind his back, cold metal clicking into place around his wrists. You set me up, he spat at me, his face twisting with rage. I tilted my head, my expression impassive. No, Daniel, I murmured. You did that all on your own. The officers began leading him toward the door, his protests growing more desperate. This isn't over, he shouted. I'll get out of this. I swear to God, I'll— The front door slammed shut behind them. And then, silence. Julia stood frozen, her body trembling. She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. You planned this. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. Yes, I did. Her breathing was uneven, her gaze flicking back to the divorce papers. You can stay and fight, I told her, my voice quiet. But let's be honest, Julia. You've already lost. She swallowed hard. And then, without another word, she reached for the pen. With shaking hands, she signed. I watched her for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Because now, I had everything I needed. And she had nothing. Julia's hands clutched my arm, her fingers cold and trembling. Her once proud, elegant face was now a mask of desperation. Please, honey, we can talk about this. I pulled away, shaking off her touch like it burned. Talk? I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Like the way you talked with my brother last night? She flinched as if I had struck her. Daniel sat frozen on the couch, his eyes darting between us, his mind no doubt racing for an escape route. But there was no way out, not for him, not for her. Then, the doorbell rang again. That would be our guests, I said, my voice unnervingly calm. I walked across the room, my footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. When I pulled open the door, my lawyer stepped in first, a thick folder clutched in his hands. Right behind him, 2 uniformed police officers entered, their presence alone enough to make Daniel stiffen. Mr. Walker, my lawyer greeted, nodding at me before turning his cold gaze to Julia and Daniel. Let's get straight to it. I gestured toward Julia, stepping aside to give her a clear view of the divorce papers my lawyer placed on the coffee table. Your signature is all that's left, I told her, my tone devoid of emotion. Her breath hitched. Please don't do this, she whispered. We've been together for 48 years. You can't just throw everything away. I cut her off with a sharp glare. You threw it away, Julia. Not me. She swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she reached for the pen. She hesitated, as if hoping for a miracle, but there were none left. With a slow, shuddering breath, she signed her name. That was it. A lifetime, reduced to ink on paper. I took the documents from the table, barely glancing at them before handing them to my lawyer. You have an hour to pack your things, I said flatly. After that, I never want to see you again. Her lips parted as if she wanted to protest, to plead, but she saw it in my eyes. There was no room left for mercy. A tense silence settled between us. Then, the officer on the right stepped forward. Daniel Walker? His voice was firm, cutting through the air like a blade. Daniel turned toward them slowly, his body taut with unease. You are under arrest for multiple counts of financial fraud and money laundering. A beat of silence. Then, wait, what? Daniel jolted to his feet, his face draining of color. No, no, this has to be a mistake. He backed up a step, then another. I didn't. This isn't. The officers weren't listening. One grabbed his arm while the other pulled out the handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Julia let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with her hands as the reality of the situation set in. But I just watched. Silently, coldly, Daniel thrashed in their grip, his eyes burning with rage as they locked onto mine. You did this, he spat. You set me up. I stepped forward, leaning in so that only he could hear me. You destroyed yourself the moment you betrayed me. The handcuffs clicked shut. Daniel let out a guttural growl, his muscles straining against the officer's grip. But it was useless. He was powerless now, just as he had tried to make me. I watched, unmoving, as they led him out the front door. Julia collapsed onto the couch, shaking her head in disbelief. This isn't happening, she murmured. This can't be happening. But it was. Through the window, I saw Daniel struggling as they shoved him into the back of the police car. His wild, panicked eyes met mine one last time before the door slammed shut. And just like that, it was over. The weight in my chest lifted, not entirely, but enough. I turned back to my now empty home, the quiet settling around me like a long-forgotten friend. For the first time in years, I felt free. As the sound of the police car faded into the distance and Julia's last footsteps disappeared down the driveway, silence settled over the house like a thick, suffocating fog. It wasn't the comforting kind of silence, the kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket. No, this was the kind that pressed against my chest, heavy with the echoes of memories, regrets, and a lifetime that had unraveled in a matter of hours. I sank into my armchair, my gaze sweeping across the living room. Everything was exactly as it had been that morning, yet nothing felt the same. The photographs on the mantel, pictures of birthdays, anniversaries, long-forgotten vacations, now felt like relics of a life that no longer belonged to me. The walls held the laughter of years gone by, but it all felt distant now, like a story that had been told to someone else. For 48 years, I had been a husband. I had loved Julia deeply, devoted myself to our family, and built a life brick by brick with my own 2 hands. And yet, all of it had crumbled so easily. A few moments of passion, a few whispered lies. That was all it took to erase a lifetime of loyalty. Betrayal is a strange thing. It doesn't just break you. It rewrites everything you thought you knew about the people you loved. I leaned forward, rubbing my temples, exhaustion washing over me like a tide. My son was gone. My brother was headed for prison, and my wife, the woman who had once promised to stand by me through everything, had walked away without looking back. What now? The question drifted through my mind, weightless yet impossibly heavy. I had spent so many years living for my family that I wasn't sure how to live for myself. Retirement had already left me with too much time on my hands, and now, without Julia or my son, the loneliness was bound to settle in quickly. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of having no purpose. I closed my eyes, letting the silence settle over me. And then, like a whisper from the past, a memory surfaced. I was standing in our old kitchen, years ago, my son perched on a stool as I flipped pancakes. He had giggled every time I tossed one in the air, clapping his tiny hands and calling me the best chef in the world. Julia, back when she still loved me, would sit at the table, sipping coffee and watching with an amused smile. Cooking. I had always loved it. The sizzle of butter in a pan, the rich aroma of spices, the way a good meal could bring people together. It had been my passion long before work and responsibilities buried it beneath the weight of obligation. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped cooking for joy and started doing it simply because I had to. But now, I had nothing but time. I pushed myself up from the chair, my joints protesting slightly as I stood. On the corner of my desk, my old leather coat rested where I had tossed it earlier. Without thinking too much, without allowing doubt to creep in, I grabbed it and shrugged it on. There was a small family-owned restaurant a few blocks away, one I used to visit often when my legs were strong enough for long walks. I remembered overhearing the owner once complaining about how hard it was to find good help. Maybe they could use someone like me, an old man with nothing but time and a deep love for food. Maybe I could start over. As I stepped out of my house, locking the door behind me, the night air filled my lungs, crisp and cool. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't walking toward the past. I was walking toward something new. My life wasn't over. It was just beginning again, on my own terms. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales. What would you have done in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, every ending is just the beginning of something new. Stay tuned for more. See you soon.